I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed so far working our way through the Bible and seeing Israel's history. We've seen the good and the bad. We've seen mistakes that they've made. We've seen when they've been faithful. And we've seen, more importantly, the power of God. And the last couple of weeks we've seen where they continue to make the same mistake over and over. And that's something, if we're being honest, it's something that we can probably relate to, is the way they kept on making mistakes. And if you're keeping up with your reading, and you've been reading with the schedule, if you've looked at tomorrow's, you'll notice that there is a mistake. In that tomorrow's reading is a bit exaggerated, in that 2/3 of the chapters there don't exist. I made a typo on the list. Deuteronomy stops at chapter 34, and so tomorrow, if you'll just read that one chapter, and forgive me for having a typo whenever I was making that list. I apologize if that created any confusion for anyone. I'm sorry about that. But that's what happens sometimes whenever you're typing up that much information and you are trying to check that many different things at once. Something slips through. But as we pick up tonight, we've seen the last couple of weeks that we've been going through, we've seen where Israel has made mistakes. They've sinned, they've grumbled and complained. Well, in our reading this past week, we saw a time whenever everything was going much better for them. In the book of Deuteronomy, God's people, the next generation of them, you remember the generation that failed to go into the promised land when they were told, they had died off in the wilderness. They've wandered for 40 years, and now Deuteronomy is the renewing of the covenant with this next generation. And when we get to the end of chapter 5, verses 22 to 27 in chapter 5, we see where God's people fear the Lord. Israel fears the Lord. And this is right after the 10 Commandments have been repeated. Specifically, if you look at verse 27, the people say, "Go near and hear all that the Lord our God says, then speak to us all that the Lord our God speaks to you, and we will hear and do it. The Lord heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me. And the Lord said to me, I've heard the voice of the words of this people which they have spoken to you. And they've done well in that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, and that it may be well with them and their sons forever. Go say to them, return to your tents. But as for you, stand here by me, that I may speak to you all the commandments and statutes and judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I give them to possess." The people they fear the Lord, they're ready to go into the land, and they've said, we're going to do exactly what God says. And that's where we get into chapter 6, and there are some very important things that we're going to cover tonight, foundational things to what God expects of His people in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1, "Now the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you are going over to possess it, so that you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God, to keep all His statutes and His commandments which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey." He charges them, hear and obey, listen and obey. They've already said, we fear, we will do what God says. And that's where we get to what Jesus will quote later on and say is the great and foremost command. Verses 4 and 5 of Deuteronomy 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart." What is considered the greatest command, what Jesus, when He was asked, what is the greatest command, the great and foremost command? To love the Lord with all the heart, soul, and might, with the entire being, that nothing is held back. And that's the idea with the heart and the soul and the might. If you move over to a couple of chapters over in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, He says, all the commandments I'm giving you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. What he's saying there is the Lord will know what's in their heart by whether or not they do what they've been told. How do you know that someone loves the Lord? Their actions. Are they obeying what he says? What's in the heart can be observed through a person's actions. The Lord said, I'm testing you, I've tested you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep the commandments. Or it's as Jesus said in John 14 and verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. How do we know if someone loves the Lord with everything they have? It's when they're ready to obey him. When they obey him when it's easy. And when they obey him when it's not so easy. You know someone loves the Lord whenever they obey him, even though you know it's going to cost them something. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Let's go to 1 John chapter 5. In 1 John 5, in verse 3, he says, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. You see, when we love the Lord, when our obedience comes from love, it's not a burden. It comes from a desire to please him. It comes from loving him. It comes from wanting his will to be first. Whenever we love him and we obey him because we love him, it doesn't come across as some people have put it, rule keeping. You know, whenever some people look at the Bible, they look at it just as a list of thou shalt nots. It's all of these things that we can't do. Well, here's all these fun things that God said we can't do anymore. But when we love the Lord, it doesn't come across that way, because we understand that his commands are about what's best for us. He tells us to love your neighbor as yourself. He understands that ultimately that's what's going to be best for his people. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might. It's more than just the emotion, the way that the world would define it. This love is a choice. You see, we can choose whether we relate to someone in love. We can choose whether we show love to someone. Emotions change all the time. The kind of love that's being commanded here is not emotional. It's a decision. We can choose to show someone love whether we feel like it or not. And that's exactly what's being talked about here. We're to love the Lord, choose to love him, choose to obey him, choose to do what's right because we trust him. It has to do with our actions and obedience to his commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. If we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, like I said, we're going to look at some things throughout this chapter. Let's go on down to verses 10 and following, where he says, it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall fear only the Lord your God, and shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth. Love the Lord your God with everything that you are, everything that you have, and serve him Only, he tells them in this chapter. They're getting ready to take the land. They were to destroy all of the idols. In chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 2, he said, when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. And the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But thus you shall do to them, you shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars, and hew down their Asherim and burn their graven images with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And in the very end of that chapter 25 and 26 of chapter 7, the graven images of their gods you are to burn with fire. You shall not covet the silver or the gold that is on them, nor shall you take it for yourselves, or you will be snared by it. For it is an abomination to the Lord your God. You shall not bring any abomination into your house, and like it come under the ban. You shall utterly detest it, and you shall utterly abhor it, for it is something banned. They're getting ready to take the land, and God knows there is idolatry in the land. Now you think about where Israel has just come out of. They've just come out of Egypt with all of its gods. And they've been exposed to that religion as a nation for 400 years. God knows that this is a temptation to them. He knows that this is going to be a problem for them. He says, when you go in, don't even look at their gods. Don't think about their gods. Don't give any attention to their altars, to their religion, to anything going on, because it will drag you away. They had a history with idolatry, so they would be tempted. You know, God had taken Israel out of Egypt, but what proved to be much more difficult and much more time-consuming was getting Egypt out of Israel. You see, they continued in their idolatrous ways for generations. In Acts chapter 7, we read the sermon of Israel's history that Stephen was giving just before he was stoned. And in giving that history in Acts 7, beginning in verse 39, he talks about that idolatry, and specifically the idolatry that went on during the 40 years in the wilderness. Our fathers were unwilling to be obedient. Acts 7, verse 39. Were unwilling to be obedient to him, but repudiated him, and in their hearts turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us. For this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. At that time they made a calf and brought a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands, but God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. It was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, was it, O house of Israel? You also took along the tabernacle of Moloch, star of the god of Rompha, the images which you made to worship. I will also remove you beyond Babylon. He makes reference there to the 40 years in the wilderness, that they were continuing to serve other gods, that they were continuing even after they had seen all of what God did in Egypt, even after they had seen plague after plague after plague, where God had showed that these idols are no gods at all and they can't do anything. They continued to carry idols with them. They continued to be tempted, and that's why God is so stern with them, so specific in telling them, have nothing to do with these gods when you go into this land, because you won't be able to handle it. They'll drag you away. They'll be a snare to you. As a matter of fact, as they took the land, Joshua gives his farewell speech. In Joshua 24, he had to tell them, even after they've been given the land, after God has given them victory over their enemies. In Joshua 24 and verse 23, therefore put away the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. God has just given their enemies into their hand. The previous chapter said God gave them all the land. Not one of his promises failed, and yet here they are still carrying these idols around. Joshua has to say to them after God has given them all of this, get rid of those idols. Earlier on in the chapter, he told them, you've got to make a decision who you will serve. The culture of Israel was such that they had carried idols with them through the 40 years. They'd come out of Egypt, which was an idolatrous nation. And they struggled to get rid of that culture. And that they made the golden calf, even after God had displayed his power. They continued to carry around these other idols. After time after time after time, God showed his power to them. God knew that his people would struggle. He says, serve me only. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Serve him only. But you know, it's easy to look back at Israel and say, wow, they had such a problem with idolatry, and remove ourselves from the equation. Because, well, we don't carry around some idol made out of wood or stone that we bow down to and bring sacrifices to. But do we not today bow down before the idol of entertainment? The idol of money? The idol of power? You know, the saying that's going around for years, he who dies with the most toys wins. A good response to that I heard is that he who dies with the most toys still dies. We still have to stand before the judgment. We still have to stand before our God. We're still going to have to answer to him for what we've done, and what will matter, whether we had a lot or we had a little, is, are we in Christ? Did we love the Lord? Did we follow his commands? Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Paul speaks about one of these idols that we still have trouble with to this day. He says, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. You see, idolatry is anything that we put on the throne before God. It can be any of these things that we've talked about, or any number of other things. Who's on the throne? It's like Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, you can't serve God and wealth. You can't have two masters. It won't work. There has to be a choice. And that's exactly what God was telling his people in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Worship and serve him only. You see, just as they had to make a choice who they would serve, we have to make that same choice, because while our idols aren't exactly the same, there are things that we still struggle with putting on the throne in place of God today. God still calls us today to love him with all of our might, to love him with all that we are, and to serve him only. There's one more real foundational thing that God calls his people to in Deuteronomy chapter 6. If we go back up in Deuteronomy 6 and pick our reading back up in verse 6, right after he tells them to love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, with all your might. These words I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. Verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Verse 20, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do these testimonies and these statutes and the judgments mean which the Lord our God commanded you? You shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed us great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he has sworn to our fathers. So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. He charged his people to teach the next generation. Teach your children. And he said there, if you go back to verse 7, talk of them when you sit in your house, you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. What does he leave out? Teach the next generation diligently, consistently, regularly, at every opportunity. When the opportunity arises, teach the next generation. And I think about what he says there in verse 20. When your son asks you in time to come. If you've ever spent much time around children, you know they're very inquisitive. They have questions. What is that? Why do you have it? What do you use it for? And they continue to ask and ask and ask. There's a reason this says when your son asks, not if your son asks. If you've been around children, you know they will ask. And you teach them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up, whenever they ask, whenever it comes up, whenever there's opportunity to declare, here's who God is, here's what he's done, here's why we serve him, here's why that's important, take that opportunity. Because when they ask, many times if you wait very long, they're not very interested anymore. Take the opportunity when it arises. And it does arise. Kids ask about everything they see. The things that we do, the things that we have. God places the responsibility of teaching the next generation on the parents. You see, Bible class on Sunday and Wednesday should simply be a supplement to what children are learning about the Lord, to go along with what the parents are teaching. In Ephesians chapter 6, chapter 6 and verse 4, he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." We're to bring our children up so that they know the Lord is first in our lives. Our children need to see us praying, reading our Bibles. They need to hear us talking about the Lord. We need to take the opportunities to tell them about who God is. You know, we looked this morning at 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may declare the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. The purpose is for us to pass on that message about who God is, and that means to our children too. Our children need to hear us telling them, talking about how wonderful our God is, because he is. If we want our children to believe, if we want our children to trust God and to serve God, we have to teach them about God. They need to hear us speaking positively of the Lord's church. Because why would they want to keep being a part of something that they hear their parents or the adults they look up to complaining about? See, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, God has given his people some very foundational instructions. Love the Lord your God with all that you have. That includes obedience, doing what he says, hearing his commands, doing them. Serve him only. Put these idols away. Get rid of these idols. Don't think about them. Don't mess with them. Don't learn about them. Put them away. God is on the throne. And teach the next generation. And you see, if we're going to teach the next generation, we have to take opportunity to talk about who God is. But we also have to model it. You see, we can say all we want to that I love the Lord. But if our actions show that we love something else more, our children will know. Because it's, as it's been said, more is caught than is taught. They see what's most important, even if it doesn't line up with what we say. God charges His people with foundational instructions here in Deuteronomy 6 to love Him, serve Him, and teach others. But we have to be seeking Him to influence others to seek Him. If we're going to be able to effectively teach our kids, we've got to love Him and serve Him fully. It's like every time you get on the airplane. They go through this instruction, the safety instructions that we usually kind of ignore. They say if the mask drops down, put yours on first and then help someone else. You see, if we're going to be able to effectively teach our kids, we've got to get our relationship with God right first. Because they see what goes on. And if our relationship with God is unimportant, they will see Jesus as unnecessary. We've got to love Him first. How's your relationship with the Lord tonight? Are you giving Him every part of your life, or is there something that you're holding back? Are you serving only Him, or is there something else that maybe gets on to the throne sometimes? And are you taking the opportunity to share with others who He is? We're going to have an invitation in just a moment. If you've allowed something else to take first place in your life, we invite you to return to Him. Return to the Lord. Rededicate yourself to following Him fully. Or if tonight you've never obeyed the gospel, we invite you to begin a walk with the Lord by being united with Jesus, by turning away from your sin and being united with Him in the waters of baptism. If we can assist you tonight, would you come while we stand and sing?